A few days ago, I gave you guys a link to a buff or nerf poll. We've done this in previous years. Which monsters need to be buffed, which monsters need to be nerfed, which monsters are mostly fine. So 619 people filled this survey out, which means I think we have a pretty decent sample size on what units should be buff candidates and what units should be nerf candidates and what units probably should not be in the balance patch at all. Will come to us, listen. No chance in hell, but just in case you guys are curious what the buff, it's fairly straightforward, the buff or nerf poll, if you didn't already respond to it. So let's take a brief look at how these things stand, and then we also have kind of a tier list style format at the end so you guys can see a visual representation. Some of these I greatly disagree with. Also, some of these things just got buffed in the recent balance patch, and I think maybe too many people haven't played around with the units after the buffs to see if they are usable or not, or how good they are. So again, let's take a look and let's see. Vanessa, for anything that's mostly red is mostly fine. The blue needs a buff. 20% of the players think that Vanessa needs a buff. She got a buff, not a crazy buff, it was a buff to skill 2 not that long ago. A little bit before that, she got a buff to skill 1. I think that could have been the same time where they modified the passive a little bit. It was a while at this point, but mostly fine. Some people, 11 people apparently, think she needs a nerf. Zaros, for the most part, is fine. 34% though think that it needs a buff, which I disagree with. I think that they buffed Zyros in the last patch to be... He kind of fell off a bit, but the buff was pretty solid. He does a lot more damage now. Perna, I think this is another weird one. Like, it seems weird to say buff Zyros, buff Perna. I think people are just getting a little bit carried away. Like, oh, well, it's not a unit for endgame RTA. It's like, not everything is endgame RTA. I know. Oh, I'm going to get so many angry messages after this. Oh, that's the only thing that really matters. Not everything is endgame RTA, guys. That's just one part of the game. So yeah, for the most part, Zaros is fine. For the most part, most people think Perna is fine. Some people think Perna needs a buff. These are the RTA players right here. Again, some people think Perna needs a nerf though. Rakan, mostly fine. Juno, mostly fine. Not enough people think Juno needs a nerf for it to really be impactful. But you start seeing the really strong units with some more orange in their profile. But again, anything that has mostly red is mostly fine. Mostly red, mostly fine. 36, I could see like getting a little buff. Wouldn't be too crazy. Some people are... these things that have a little slice of orange and a little slice of blue, people kind of have mixed opinions on, depending on if they run a bruiser comp or if they run a turn 1 control comp, is whether or not they think Mei Hao Wang is not strong enough or too strong. It's really, a lot of it is based on playstyle. A lot of it is also helps what other units you have in your box, because maybe if you have some units that synergize really well with some of the units here, then these units may seem perfectly fine to you. But if you are lacking some of those units, like for example, Tianlang Ragdoll really change the game for a lot of players, and more units could be potentially usable with those units at your disposal. Veligil, a lot of people think that Veligil needs a buff. He did just get a buff not too long ago. It wasn't a crazy buff. He heals with skill 2 a little bit. Not really anything too ridiculous. Maybe if he had some damage mitigation. Maybe if he had... I don't know what I would really do with Veligil, because he is a defense-based unit, and additional damage in artifacts is really strong right now. It has been strong for a while. Kumar, 48%. Personally, I think Kumar is totally fine, totally usable for me. I am not every player. I don't know if too many people have really played with Kumar in as much content as I have. I'm perfectly fine with Kumar, though. I think he's a great unit. Rocky actually did get a buff. The multi-hits on skill 3 were solid. A lot of people still think it needs a buff. If 59.9% of the players think it needs a buff, then I think that's, regardless of what I even say, I think that that's something Comtua should consider. I think Beth is pretty heavy on the needs buff as well. But this much, 2/3 almost of the people polled think that it needs a buff. It's worth taking a look at for Comtuas. For the most part, Chu is fine. For the most part, Brandy is fine. But like 1/3 of the players thought it needed a buff. It's really not a PvP unit. It's more of a PvE unit. She can do a lot of damage in PvE. She can do a lot of damage in PvP too, but yeah, Tessarian is a great unit. Underrated, I think. Okeanos, as crazy as it is, Oki was very strong a few seasons ago. They changed his skill 3 to do less multi-hits. People stopped using him so much. Also, the meta changed as well, but it's just crazy to see Oki. But Oki was probably as a needs a nerf unit, and now people aren't using him as much. I bet that if people just use him more in RTA, then he wouldn't be so blue. More people would either think he's fine, or some people that are scarred and emotionally damaged by Oki Violent procs would say that he needs a nerf. It's really the things that I've noticed needs the nerfs the most are the things that people have been traumatized the most by in RTA. If people are picking it, they're not going to say it needs a nerf. It could be very strong, but if people are not picking it, they're not going to say, the people pulled are not going to say that needs a nerf. Sekhmet, mostly fine. Daphnis, mostly fine, but some people have gotten burned enough by his not so great base speed and also potential to miss with skill 3. The Wind Striker is, I'm sure, going to be much higher in the blue. So we'll take a look at that in a second. Xiangfei is really not... You could use him in PvP. He's not really a PvP unit per se. I think he's great in PvE. But also that cleanse. I think maybe some people haven't used him in a while. And it depends on what are the units you combo him with. But he was a unit that we have tinkered around with in RTA even, and he's actually done better than people would expect. Same thing with Kumar. It's like these units do better than you would expect. Maybe not G1, G2, G3 level of gameplay, but still solid enough unit that, especially against control. Like if you can get him cleansing things, then it's really not bad. Helena, I actually haven't used Helena in a while, but when she goes crazy, and she's very strong. When she doesn't go crazy, not quite so strong. Also, Helena could be decent against the against Oliver and Miles combinations. A lot of people using Oliver and Miles. She takes less damage from Miles, and also Oliver has the chance to miss on her, so that's something worth noting potentially. Ophelia, I expected more to be blue on Ophelia, needs buff, but really mostly fine. Again, 70% of the players say they're fine with it being the way it is. Then really we don't need to, get the pitchforks out and say, oh, this thing needs a buff. However, so we have Baliger again, same thing. Bale, 56% think it needs a buff. That's worth noting. I don't disagree. Who says it needs a nerf? 8 people think that Bale needs a nerf. 8 people might think that this is a different unit. This is the Fire Demon. So, Masha, for the most part, is fine. Jogun, for the most part, is fine. Douglas, some people burned by Douglas. Some people are Wind Robo abusers, burned by Douglas right there. All of her Wind Robo abusers. Bernadotte, this is the Fire Shadow Claw. Mostly is fine. Carnal mostly is fine. Tamo mostly is fine. Coco, I strongly disagree with this. I think Coco, if you're trying to use Coco in everywhere, not really an everywhere unit. If you're trying to use Coco against, if you find that your opponent is picking Ragdoll, Kinky, Douglas, trying to auto you, Vertiheel, and Leo, Coco is a great unit. Coco's the Fire Mage. Coco's a great unit in those instances. I think you might just be the people that think that she needs a buff. You might just be picking her in the wrong situation. You might be trying to bring her in too many places. She is a good unit against those bruiser teams where the opponent just doesn't want to play. You pick Coco and you don't even have to worry about crit rate, crit damage. You just put a bunch of HP, a bunch of attack power on her, and try to get a lot of damage mitigation in her artifacts, and she is better than you think against those annoying combinations. Or maybe this is people that, I was going to say people that play those combinations, but yeah, I really don't think that Coco needs a buff, personally. I think it's a totally usable unit. I use it not even as a gimmick, as an actual legitimate pick, and it does perfectly fine. John, I think, is a perfectly fine bomber. For the most part, most people agree with me. Nor is a solid unit. Carlos is a solid unit. All of these things. Ren, enough people. I thought that with the crazy base speed, I did not think that so many people were going to think that this needs a buff. Apparently, people still think that Ren needs a buff. I'm sure that the Wind one is going to be the same situation. Claire is... I expected more from Claire. I expected more. I expected this to be so blue. I expected this to be the one that's super blue, and this to be the one that is more red. So that's the surprising thing. I have these units on one account or another. I've played with all of them, and I'm just surprised that Claire was not. We gotta hurry this up. Okay, Lucia, Fire Pudding Princess. More buffs, people say. It's when she works, when she or he or whatever. When the unit works, it's very annoying to deal with, especially in a passive-based bruiser team in PvP. Not really for every content though. It's really kind of a use it in RTA in a specific team. So not very flexible. Alice the Fire Macaron Guard, 61.7%. Think that she needs a buff. So that's worth noting. Zima Fire Puppeteer. I would agree with this. I didn't actually take the poll. I mean, I could have, but I'm gonna complain about it in the video anyway. So you guys gonna get my opinion whether or not you want it. Zima the Fire Puppeteer. I would be in this blue category of needing a buff for that unit. Patrick the Fire Steel Commander. I think that this could be good with a buff that is similar to, like just kind of like Trevor or Tessarion or Xingzhe, like damage mitigation. In that, I think that could be a nice way to buff Patrick. But 68.9% think it needs a buff. Assure the Fire does. I am surprised that this is so blue. I think we got this on one account. No, did we? Maybe we didn't. We got the wind one. I don't think we did get this on any account. No, because we got this. We got the Assassin's Creed version of the Steel Commander. I don't think we got this on anything, but it did get a buff 2 patches ago. So I'm surprised that so many people still think it needs a buff, but I don't think that we've played with it firsthand. I think that I'm trying to remember exactly what the situation is, but I think I took some people's word for it that it's like a solid unit now. So I'm just surprised it's so blue. Fire Gladiatrix is a solid unit, especially on Nemesis runes now. Fire Indra just got all the Indras just got buffs. I don't think we played with Fire Indra since the buff though, so that's kind of my fault, but 69% think it needs a buff. Bloodjet Fire Devil Maiden, 66.2. I would be one of the people that thinks it needs a buff as well. Fire Dokebi Lord. We saw a little bit of it, haven't really played around with it firsthand, so it's still new. We'll see. The dots are mostly not really a PvP thing. Dots are usually like PvE. It depends. Dots can sometimes be great for PvP, but yeah. The dots and destroy are a nice combination, but apparently 41% of the players think it's not, so. Camilla, it's just weird to see, like, it's not 2015, so I'm surprised that so many people think Camilla needs a nerf. Some people have obviously been burned by Camilla. They are control players. I do not think Camilla needs a nerf at all. I do not think Camilla needs a nerf at all. I personally do not have a problem with Camilla, so I guess well, 65% of the players also don't have too much of a problem with Camilla either. Varad, for the most part. This is odd. Sigmaris. Sigmaris is really not an endgame PvP unit. It's not supposed to be, is it? Or it is a solid early game unit for dungeons, for TOA, for... It's decent enough at farming. It's not the most premium farming unit, but I don't think Sigmaris needs a buff personally. I would disagree with 63% of the population. It is not intended to be an endgame PvP unit. Not every unit is supposed to be used for endgame PvP or used everywhere. It's a fusion unit. You gotta kind of be a little bit more lenient on these fusion things and think, okay, maybe. Not everything is Riley. Riley is just ridiculous everywhere. Not everything is Riley. So some of these units are generally intended for like the dark vampire lore as well. These things, and also Xiang Fei, the Fire Panda, these things are intended mostly for PvE. That's just how it is. It doesn't necessarily need a buff. It's not intended for endgame PvP. Not everything is intended for endgame PvP. What else do we have? Water Chimera, mostly fine. Praha, mostly fine. Anifil, mostly fine. Chow, I could kind of agree if they stick something else in his passive. I'm not going to complain. Personally, I have a decent win rate with Chow, but I could see people wanting him to be more useful. I could definitely see that. Shihao, for the most part, is fine. Ariel is mostly an arena defense unit. You could stick him in a couple places in RTA and hope that you don't get CC'd to death, but is really, in the current RTA meta, it is very hard to make aerial happen. It's also very hard to make aerial happen in guild content. It's also, he's okay sometimes in defense, arena defense. Aside from that, and also maybe some dungeons, but no one's doing dungeons with aerial. They're looking for speed teams, so I can get along with this 42% there. Chandra mostly fine. Beth was better before. My personal opinion, I like Beth more before the change. It's really that debuff. It's the cleanse. It's the anti-cleanse debuff that people really are not a fan of. Wusa's mostly fine. Alicia's mostly fine. Needs a buff. Alicia does not need a buff. She's one of the best arena offense units in the game. She is also potentially a nasty RTA cleave unit. We've had some really, really fun wins with Alicia in RTA cleaves. I would rethink this if you think that Alicia needs a buff. It could be your runes. It could be the strategy. It could be what you're bringing in with her, because Alicia is a solid unit. It's one of my favorite units to use on multiple accounts. Solid unit. I do not at all think that she needs a buff. I think she's plenty fine. Theomars, mostly fine. Poseidon, mostly fine. Bastet, mostly fine. Buff Bastet. Samoth, mostly fine. Some people just want everything to be buffed. Molong, mostly fine. Needs buff. You guys, you complained like 2 years ago that he needed a nerf. You're like, he's too OP. He needs a nerf. Now you're like, he's not OP enough. He needs a buff. Make up your mind. Amelia. Almost the 30%. I'll show you in a bit why the 30% is kind of a threshold that I went with. But most people think Amelia is fine. She's not for everything, but for the most part. Josephine, mostly fine. Abelio can be toxic. Very, very toxic, especially when he resists anything that cools him down. He can be very toxic in arena defense. He can be very toxic in RTA. It's RNG that makes Abelio potentially toxic, because people will bring counters to this unit, and sometimes it just won't do anything. So, very frustrating. I speak from first-hand experience. Bulwark, for the most part, fine, is a great unit, I think. Belial cannot be used everywhere. If he got something extra in his passive, I would not complain. Like a little bit more attack gauge, like a guaranteed extra turn when he pops up would be nice. Or when he pops up, he's like definitely got that skill 2 ready and he can nuke something. That would be great. I could see that. I could definitely see that. Barbara, man, people were using Barbara all the time a couple of years ago. Now 53% say buff Barbara. So many people using Leo. Hey Gang needs a nerf. Hey Gang has been Hey Gang. Now people finally starting to appreciate Hey Gang for what he is. He's always been a strong unit. He's always been a unit that's kind of, you have to actually know what you're doing to use Hey Gang. Well, for the most part, I guess. I guess you don't have to, but yeah, Hey Gang is not a very cut and dry. Well, he kind of is cut and dry. I don't know, guys. I think Hey Gang is fine. I don't think he needs a nerf. Apparently, he's frustrated some players that like to use more, like to use robos, like to use cleave teams, control cleave teams. But Hey Gang is doing what Hey Gang's supposed to be doing. He is there to frustrate players that are trying to outspeed and control. That is his job. That is the only thing that he is there for. He's not for most things. So if you nerf him, he is going to have no purpose at all. It's very binary, this unit. Moore has apparently frustrated a lot of people. That is kind of what Moore does. Borgnine, I mean, if they gave Moore a little bit less damage, maybe could be less frustrating without like changing the unit completely. Just like decreasing the damage multiplier or something. I don't know. It's mostly the additional damage that people get from him, though. That's the frustrating part, I would think. Borgnine is a very specific unit. He has a very specific niche. He is there for PvP against bruisers. That's the only thing he's there for. He does good if you use him in the right. He doesn't even need sculpts. This is the great thing about Borgnine. A lot of people think he needs a buff. I think that the buff that they gave him, initially, I thought that the buff they gave him was not enough. When they gave him the destroy, I was like, because he also, when he destroys HP, they do less damage. Keep that in mind if you didn't already know that. Initially, I didn't think that buff was enough, but after I played with it for a couple more days, I was like, wow, you know what? It actually is enough. It was actually a pretty solid buff. It was like a year ago, I think. It was not any time recently, but yeah, that buff was not bad. He's not for everything, though, and he's definitely not for RTA. If you're trying to use him in RTA, that's not the right spot for him. Honestly, the best, it's terrible to say, and maybe people just want to be more flexible, but the best part about the best place for him is inter-server arena, which a lot of people don't care about. But yeah, that is his best usage. Some Guild Siege too. He's nice. Shizuka for the most part is okay. Nana for the most part is okay. Miles, 46%. That is quite a sizable percentage. Say that he needs a nerf. Leo is his nerf. That's the one nerf. If Leo is banned, then he is a very dangerous unit. So, yeah. He can still be... Well, he can still be controlled. He can still be cleaved, killed, but he's very fast with his passive. So... yeah, Leo's his best counter. So we have Aaliyah, mostly fine. Liam, this is kind of a cleave unit though. I mean, he can also be a control unit, depending on how many units are on the other side of the battlefield. But I think Liam is pretty fine. I think if you think that Liam, if you've voted here, think that Liam needs a buff, I would say use him with the Fire Art Master. That is a brutal combination. Try him out with that. Once you get that combination done and ready, then you might have a different opinion on Liam. Can't use it everywhere, but when you can, it is nasty. Then we have Minato, who just got buffed not too long ago. We also have Amber. This is crazy, because Amber used to be so, like, probably the last one that we did. Probably a decent amount of orange in there too, like a little sliver more than we have here. And probably most of the people would have said that she's fine, maybe needs a little nerf. Now, after the nerf, because they nerfed her not too long ago, 2 patches ago, I think, this many people think she needs a buff. That's crazy. That is really crazy. I would have thought that this amount of blue would be on the fire one, not on Amber. And then we have Adriana the Water putting Princess, low base speed. Kind of is a struggle with this unit. I wonder if the base speed was higher, if this would be a different story, and more people would be cleaving, and you would see like half the amount of blue, half the amount of needs a buff. Water Macaron Guard needs a nerf. It was already nerfed. A lot of people can't even use it because it's an RNG unit. Sometimes she'll screw you, but it's not her that's screwing you. It's RNG that's screwing you. Welcome to Summoner's War. Not anything crazy, but for the most part, 2/3 of the players think it's fine. Some people think it needs a buff. Some people think it needs a nerf based on their personal experience with the unit. Water Puppeteer, mostly fine. Water Steel Commander. I think that after the buff, he's so much faster, so much more usable. What was the combination we were using with it? We were using this, the Water Steel Commander, Savannah, and Poseidon was actually a pretty solid combination. So take that into consideration. I don't think that he needs anything crazy right now. He seemed to be fine when we were playing with him. Water Mercenary Queen. I'm not a huge fan of this unit, so I would be in the blue too for this. I understand that she gets stronger based on the passive, but just for me, it seems like it's not very exciting. I never have fun using it, so I don't use it anymore. Water Indra is actually a pretty decent unit. He is kind of similar to Tyrannus, but he is a water and he has AoE damage. I think it's a solid enough unit. I don't think some people think it needs a nerf. 4.2% think it needs a nerf. 38% think it needs a buff. That's kind of like maybe rethink if you think that it needs a buff. If this many people think it needs a nerf, not that it's like thousands of people think it needs a nerf, but if there are people out there, a decent amount that think it needs a nerf, maybe test it out again. Maybe check your runes. Maybe try using it in a different place or with a different synergy, because I think that this is actually just it's a perfectly fine unit. It's not triple S tier super premium, but it is a perfectly usable unit. Water Devil Maiden, I think mostly it's her second skill that people have the problem with. So maybe if there's a rework on the second skill of this and the other one, the other Devil Maiden that has the same second skill, that could be needs a nerf. 2 people think it needs a nerf. But yeah, I think that might be the issue there. The Water Dokebi Lord, too early, really. I'm not going to give too much input on this. I still think it's kind of early to call it. So it is what it is. Katarina. Katarina is actually a solid unit. I use it against bruiser teams that don't have strips. I actually use it. This is one of my most effective arena offenses. You can't use it against a lot of stuff, but when you can use it, it's Jameer, Kabezanuf, Katarina, and Wusa, and it wins almost every time. What is that? that Sex Panther quote or whatever it is from Anchorman. I don't remember. Someone put it in the comments so I can sleep tonight, because otherwise it's going to keep me up all night. Or I can just Google it, I suppose. But yeah, works all the time. What is it, 60% of the time, works every time? I don't know. Anyway, I don't know why we keep talking about that. Katarina, it's not intended to be for everything. That's the thing. It's a unit that you need to combo. It is good for some siege, some arena offense, if the opponent doesn't have fast strips, or if the opponent really doesn't have strips. If they have slow strips and you can outspeed all of the strips with the rest of your units, then it's fine. Katarina has high base speed, but for the most part, it's really these fusion units. I know people think it needs a buff, but they're not supposed to be triple S tier units. They're supposed to be fusion units that are accessible to everyone, give people wind damage dealer. So yeah, Jameer mostly fine, Tashar mostly fine, but you see this issue with all the fusions. They're not supposed to be super strong PvP units. Aside from Riley, Riley's just a frustration. Like Baron, enough people think it needs a buff. Personally, I feel with the Legbaron issue, so I got him recently on multiple, not recently, like a year ago, on multiple accounts, and didn't have him for so long, was very excited, and then I'm like, he seems to not ever work. That's the issue. That's my issue with him, and I think it's just my personal luck that he doesn't ever do anything with skill 3. It's just like, oh, everything misses. Well, that's Summoner's War, so I don't know if it's Summoner's War or if it's this unit just is cursed. I don't know what the situation is. Sierra seems crazy that it sees 39% of the population, maybe not the greater population, but 39% of the people polled think that Sierra needs a buff. I would disagree. I think she's fine. I think bombs are really strong against certain teams. Yeah, but I mean, she's probably not a great unit against. Well, I've still beaten Junos with Sierra, so I don't know. I really don't think that she needs a buff at all. My personal opinion. I would agree with 2/3 of you, almost. So Charlotte. See, that's kind of weird. Like, people are appreciating Charlotte for what she does, but Ciara has more people that think she needs a buff. Leo is a nice solid counter to a lot of frustrating teams, a lot of frustrating control teams. So thinking that Leo needs a buff, he's the only unit that does what he does. So. Yeah, Xingzhe, mostly fine. I mean, Leo's mostly fine anyway, but it's just surprising to see people thinking Leo needs a buff, because no one else does what Leo does. So I don't think he's going to get a buff unless it's like guaranteed the tech bar pushback as his passive. Aside from that, what else are you going to do? It's like everything gets negative 1,000 speed. Okay, I don't know. So what else? Xingzhe, mostly fine. Eladriel, it's the same reviver issue. We complain about revivers every time. We're like, what needs to be buffed? What needs to be nerfed? We complain about these things all the time. It's a reviver issue, because you can say the same about the other revivers as well. Like the light Epicon Priest. Who's using her? No one. Maybe some people using her for Siege. Maybe a couple of you. Maybe some people using her for Tartarus. Because these are okay units for Tartarus, like Eladriel and Iona. You could use them there, but those are really the best place for them, the best time for them to shine. Ritesh, 40% of the population not the population, can't keep saying that. That's not accurate. 40% of the people polled think that he needs a buff. Ethna, for the most part, needs a nerf. Ethna's very frustrating. When you don't counter her well enough, that can be very frustrating. She's very fast and she does a lot. So, Pungbek is actually better than you guys realize. Use him for arena offense. You'll have a great time. He's better than you realize. He was already buffed. If you're maybe coming back to the game, he was already buffed, if you didn't notice. Tiana, for the most part, is a great unit. No one else has the reliability that Tiana has. Akamir, yeah, I could agree. People think he needs a buff. Although with the B12 dungeons, the Abyss dungeons, Akamir actually got more use, so it's fine. It's nice to see people finally using him. Triton's very fast. I know people think he needs a buff, but his point is, like, the purpose of Triton is if you are getting in a chicken fight of like who's got the faster speed, Triton's going to be one of those units that's pulled out at some point. Hathor, it's funny how Hathor, people would complain about her so much. She drops out of the meta and now people are like, oh, she needs a buff. It's basically the same unit. There's just been more things that can counter Hathor that people are just naturally picking. Ganymede for the most part is fine. Fingan for the most part is fine. It's crazy to see this needs nerf thing after they just buffed him in the last patch. Diana used to be so toxic. I guarantee you this needs nerf. 2 years ago, whenever we first started doing things like this, these polls, I guarantee you the orange on here must have been massive with all those traumatic Diana experiences. She can still be traumatic. Don't be fooled. She does not need a buff. She can still be traumatic. She can still do it. Louise, 31%. Louise actually is not as bad. I should use her more, but she's not as bad. She's not crazy. She's not ridiculous OP. Tyrannus, there's so many resets nowadays that Tyrannus just has no chance of being an RTA. There's just so much strong stuff against Tyrannus now, which didn't used to be the case, but yeah. Odin, for the most part, is fine. Christina. We complained that Christina needed buff. She got a buff. And then the Molly defenses, the Molly, Dominic, Molly, Dominic, Theomars, sometimes Molong, sometimes Wind Mage defenses in Siege now are not really a thing anymore. So now Christina needs a buff again. I suppose there's still people that use Christina, but for the most part, she's kind of, when those defenses went away, Christina stopped being useful. Again, I'm sorry, Christina. You had a brief time where you were really solid, but some people I'm sure will still disagree with me. They'll be like, "No, I still use her." I'm like, "Where? Where? You don't even know. I still use her." It's like, I can see you use her. You streaming out Twitch. I didn't even see you use her at all. Mephisto, decent enough. I personally haven't used him in a while, but decent enough unit. Some people like to use him a lot against the revive comps. So this is the Wind Demon. Most of you know that, I'm sure. Savannah mostly fine. Sheng Peng mostly fine. Some people traumatized by Sheng Peng. I don't blame you. Even sometimes he counters the things that counter him. So that's Summoner's War. It's Summoner's War. This is Summoner's War is the toxic thing. The toxic part of this this equation. Kashmir, 60%. 60% of you are correct. This thing needs a buff badly. I don't know. Some people disagree, but needs who thinks that needs? Oh my god! I guess it works for this many people. This many people have seen this unit actually do what he's supposed to do. For me, I just keep seeing him fail at everything. Cigar, Xiao, but I'm glad people appreciate what she can do. Momo. So Momo, not a unit that I use. Sometimes it can be a decent damage dealer, but I don't really personally use. I don't think I even have this to use it. And of course, we come to Oliver, which is just a massive slice of cheddar cheese right here. 48.9% think this unit needs a nerf. He got nerfs. That's the crazy part. This is after multiple nerfs. But if you keep nerfing him, then he becomes F tier again. So right now, he's like triple S tier, double S tier, however you want to slice it, but needs a buff. 15% diehard Oliver users that just got Douglas over and over and over again. Douglas then Ragnald. Riley, 31%. Crazy for a fusion unit. Not the same pie as we see for the other fusion units. Dominic, for the most part, fine. Some people are polarized on Dominic. Zen, a lot of people think. I mean, we saw this on the Fire one as well. 51% think it needs a buff. Have you played? The 51% of you that voted that he needs a buff, have you played with him recently? He's usable recently. He's not the same unit as he used to be. He got buffed multiple times. Test him out again. I could see the argument that he needs to be tweaked a little bit, but test him out again. He's not as painfully weak as he used to be. Sonya is fine after her changes. I don't remember which patch it was. A lot of people use Sonya in high level gameplay. That's got to say something, right? Not very strong against Leo, but yeah, a lot of the strongest units in the game are weak against Leo. That's why there's no place to be like Leo needs a buff. It's like Leo's the counter to some of the best units in the game. He really, how are you gonna say he needs a buff? Yeah, Sonya's fine. Angela the Wooden Pudding Princess. I can't remember the last time I used this unit. It did get a buff 2 patches ago, I think. But yeah, I wouldn't really argue with that. The 49%. Wind Macro on guard. I don't know. I can't remember the last time I even used this either. So it is actually similar to. No, it's not similar to that one. There's a lot of these units that are like buff support units that I'm like, I don't use this, I don't use this, I don't use this. So, but I think it's she decreases cooldown, she does shields and defense buffs or something. I honestly can't remember the last time. We got her, we skilled her up, I stopped using her 2 days later. So maybe this is justified. Maybe the 60% is justified. Smice of the Wind Puppeteer. This does not need a buff. This is a very solid unit after the buff. It does not need anything. Veramos is a strong counter to it. Maybe the people that are voting this needs a buff are fighting a lot of Veramos, possibly, or Raccoony, because Veramos and Raccoony are strong against Wind Puppeteer. But that's why a lot of people like to play, especially with like when I did the video playing with the Wind Puppeteer, Raccoony with Smicer, and that's because Raccoony is just a solid counter to this unit. So keep that in mind. Actually, a decent unit now. So Shahat Wind Desert War. I'm glad I'm not the only one that feels this way about Shahat. This is actually, I think, the most. It might be the most or one of the most needs a buff unit. That's something to be said there. 70.1% think it needs a buff. That's a lot. Then we have the Wind Gladiator. Why is this doing that? Wind Gladiatrix 50. I'm actually surprised because I think this is a decent enough unit that I'm surprised that so many people think it needs a buff. Wind Indra. This did also get a buff in the last patch. I'm not sure if you guys have played with it yet. Test it out again. I don't think I have tested it out again. So maybe we should also practice what we preach. But yeah, I'm sure we will. Do I have it? Sometimes I don't know what I have on all these accounts. To try to remember. Wind Devil Maiden 60.5. It's a lot of the new ones though. You see these big blue areas of need a buff, need a buff, need a buff, need a buff, need a buff. Wind Dokebi Lord 50%. This is the one that basically Miho just counters him hard. Miho Ragdoll, but it is what it is. He's decent because he crits and you don't need to worry about crit rate and crit damage, but I think might be a better Guild Siege unit than anything else. Or a last pick RT. You could pick him earlier than last pick though, if you wanted to. But yeah, a Chroma. So we're finally on the LDs. We are taking way too long doing this. I'm sorry, let's try to speed it up. I already said we were going to speed it up. I feel like it's justified. I was playing with a Chroma a few months ago, and it was not doing as well as I had expected it to do. So I feel like that might be justified. Zerath is fine. Ludia is fine. I wish Ludia had like one more turn of cooldown. Or one less turn of cooldown on skill 3, or like a little bit more on skill 2, kind of like how Perna does the strip. So, by the way, Perna does the strip now, if some of you guys didn't notice that. But yeah, personally just getting her, I'm like, oh, I kind of wish she did a little bit more. But it's not, if she doesn't get a buff, it's not the end of the world. I'll still use her. I use her every day. It's fine. It's not a terrible unit. Sean, the light chimera, mostly fine. Julianne, enough people are scarred by Julianne now being a little bit better than it used to be. Lima, for the most part, is fine. Laura, people have been traumatized by Laura. Enough people. Jaeger needs a buff. Said the same thing about Chow. Said the same thing about Leica. Ragdoll Leo, of course, Ragdoll Leo is not going to be super blue like these units, but if you compare them all, this is an anti-CC unit. So the issue with the Jaeger, and he does do revenge, but the issue with the Jaeger is if you keep his attack bar decreased, he's not as, same thing with Chow, it's not as dangerous. So I have seen Jaeger do some pretty nice stuff though. So it really depends. Kitien Dasheng, I'm surprised more people did not vote this orange. There are Meihao Wang is around, so I guess there's that between Meihao Wang, Josephine, Raccoony. I guess that's why Kitien Dasheng is not so crazy OP as he was before, but he's a strong unit. He's a strong unit. We have Artemil. He's a niche pick. You got to kind of pick him towards the end. He could sometimes be okay against control teams, but he could also get controlled himself. He could also get cleaved. He's not as OP as he once used to be, but everyone knows that by now. Shazam actually he does not need a buff as much as I think some of you guys think. Maybe I don't know. He's pretty usable. As someone that has Shazam, I can put Shazam in places That sounds weird. I can use Shazam in guild content. I can use Shazam in interserver arena. I can use Shazam in RTA. He actually works fairly well in all of those places. I don't think that this unit needs a buff. I know everyone's always like, oh, buff my LD5, but I think this unit is solid enough. Aside from that he's not crazy fast, that's the biggest issue. He's got solid HP. He does a decent amount with his skills. He's got the skill. The skill one is actually not that bad. It's the strip and the defense break. Not a bad skill 3. Sorry, skill 1. Skill 3 is not bad either. But yeah, I don't think this unit needs a buff. Just my personal opinion. Asima is very strong. It seems about what I think people would expect. These units are all fairly solid, mostly red, which means mostly okay. Elsharion, people think it needs a buff. Maybe the same damage mitigation as Tessarion has. Damage mitigation. That's my answer all day. It's like, maybe this unit could have some more damage mitigation, and that could make him better. Because Elsharion could be a nasty unit in a speed-based cleave, but Leo's a strong counter to that. He's going to limit the amount of damage that the Elsharion can do. So, yeah. Pontos, mostly fine. Isis, mostly fine. Some people think it needs a buff. It's the only unit that can do AoE Oblivion. Well, that's not true anymore, is it? That's not true. Because Tomo can technically kind of do AoE Oblivion. So, also, Shizuka can kind of do AoE Oblivion. As long as you pair the Tessarion with it. So, that might be worth noting. We have Wedget. 29.4%. It's just that he's so meta now. People are traumatized by him. If less people were playing with him, less people would be voting for him needing a nerf. Even if he did the exact same things, it's just people are less traumatized by him. Yeah, I think that might be an overreaction. I know he's strong now, but I think some of these might be slight overreactions. Tian Lang is basically the same unit he always... No, he actually got modified at some point. He got changed, and he got changed a little bit differently. But for the most part, he's very, very similar to what he always was. But he was actually changed a little bit. Celia needs a... This many people think Celia needs a nerf? Why? What Celias have you fought against where she's done such amazing things that you're like, she is unreasonable. She needs to be nerfed. Was it Guild Siege defense? That's the only place she does anything, is Guild Siege defense. That's probably where you saw her. So, yeah, when you actually use Celia, she doesn't do a damn thing. So, yeah, that many people know that it's got to be Siege defense. I've seen her do toxic things on Siege defense. Aside from that, not really so much. Eleanor... this is the pony, the unicorn, light unicorn. So, I think the same kind of a similar place to Akroma, of like her utility. Light paladin, mostly fine. Weird that this is mostly fine, and Sigmaris is like, oh, this needs a buff. It's wacky. I'm surprised that people care about Light Paladin. Volantis is a very strong unit. Most people think he's fine, but some people think he needs a nerf. Geldnir. Honestly, Geldnir used to be this giant blue, like, this thing is crap and needs a buff. Finally, people appreciating Geldnir. I suppose. It's just the meta changes. That is one of the things. Lucifer, mostly fine. Narsha, mostly fine. Hanwul, mostly fine. Almost 40% think he needs a buff. Talisman, mostly fine. Craig, mostly fine. Saime, mostly fine. I can't... When she first got the change in the balance, I think it was like 9 months ago, maybe a year ago. I didn't remember, and absolutely got wrecked by this unit because I forgot what she did with her passive. So that was fun. Dorothy needs a buff. This is the light mage. So enough people still think she needs a buff. For the most part, Daniel is okay. Ella is mostly okay. What else? Benedict, 31%. I will defer to the Benedict owners because I feel like I never have a great handle on Benedict. I think we might have played with him once. Aside from that, not really so much. Veronica, 18% think she needs a nerf. This is a strong unit. She did actually get nerfed, though, 2 patches ago, I think. Ariana, the light pudding princess, 42% think she needs a buff. Light macaron this is a unit. My wife has this on her account. I was playing with it actually a fun enough unit. It's not a terrible unit. It did get changed. I don't know if this is more people don't like it after the modification from the last balance patch, because she works differently than she used to. I haven't tried it since then, but that could be the issue there, or maybe they just didn't like it ever. But at one point, it was a usable unit that I had fun playing with. Light Puppeteer. I can't remember the last time I actually played with or saw this unit in action, so I'm just going to not say anything. Decent amount, 40%. Think it needs a buff, though. Light Dual Blade. Altair, Frederick, 60.7. I agree. Yeah, I agree. It needs more survivability. Maybe put some damage mitigation in a passive form. That's always the answer in my mind. Light Steel Commander, 34.5%. Think it needs a buff. Light Mercenary Queen. Depends on if you play Control and you think it needs a nerf, or if you own it and want to stick it everywhere, that phrasing, and think it needs a buff so you could play with it everywhere. Again, phrasing, don't you want to play with it everywhere? Don't you want to play with your monster? Okay, listen, I'm going to stop talking. Let's just say some numbers. Light Indra, 29.4, need a buff. Jessica, I mean, for the most part, if 2/3 of the players think it needs, thinks it's fine, it's usually a good indication, but yeah, Haunt, really, so many people think Haunt needs a nerf. You haven't experienced him not defense breaking at all ever on skill 3. I have, and it's not fun. It happens. So, Trinity, 63.1%. Maybe buff Trinity, come to us. Just saying. There's a lot of people don't like these Valkyrias. Grogan, I appreciate that people are giving Grogan the respect that he deserves. He is a solid unit, mostly for arena offense, in my opinion, but solid unit. Jara, I would agree. Jara needs a buff. If they just gave Jara the Perna treatment, I think it would be just fine. Revives from the dead, I think it'd be fine. Cadiz, Zaratu, both fine. Gianna, actually in a good spot right now. Not crazy OP like she used to be. People are doing better countering her. Then we have Nikki, who actually is more dangerous nowadays than Gianna. But that's Summoner's War. So many multi-hits. Attack power buffs, heal blocks, multi-hits. The heal blocks that Beth should have, excuse me, is what Nikki has. So many multi-hits, though. Great cleave unit. Then we have Ragdoll, which is almost a necessary unit. Needs a nerf. They can't. There's so many people that bought Ragdoll accounts. If they nerfed Ragdoll, those people would stop playing. There's no way they're going to do a substantial nerf to Ragdoll anytime ever. They won't. They can't. They would lose so many players. They would lose so many players that maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe it's an exaggeration, but they would definitely be pissed. All the people that bought Ragdoll accounts, Gianna accounts were the big two sellers for a long time. More recently, Nephthys accounts and T-Online accounts were up there as well. But Nephthys accounts, after her modification, like a year ago, they started being one of the more sought-after LD accounts to buy. So, Sun Zanglau, I always wanted this unit. It's pretty solid. Seems fun. I think the activation rate could be better, but yeah, I always thought it was a potential fun unit to hopefully one day get, even though I'm not even summoning my LD scrolls. Fermion, 54%. I think that's worth noting, though. If 54% think it needs a buff, then yeah, same thing with Raoul. Same thing with the the Dark Hell Lady, which I can't say the name on YouTube. Wall-Young also seems fine for the most part. Woonsa seems fine for them. It's too high of a base speed to buff Woonsa. Some of the people that think that it needs a buff are people that have fought against enemies that don't have beneficial effects to steal. That's what that is. Lydia would be nice if she was a little bit more useful. Maybe a damage mitigation passive. I'm just saying, just throwing that out there for the 45th time in this video. Veramos does not need a buff, but Veramos is fine. He's great in PvP. He's great in PvE. He's fine. He's good. He's a fusion unit, guys. I don't know what you want. Some people probably just click and needs a buff for every single thing, and they're laughing right now. They've been laughing the whole video. Like, he just didn't realize I put need a buff for every unit. Jerks. But Anon. I said that the right way. That's terrible. 43%. I would agree with that. I think that unit could definitely get a buff. Sylvia, for the most part, is fine. Thabay keeps getting buffs. That's the thing. Thabay keeps getting buffs. I've seen Thabay do crazy things. Mostly the violent Brocs are why Thabay does crazy things. Not really the buffs necessarily. But skill 3, skill 3, skill 3, skill 3, skill 3. Like, okay, calm down. Calm down, Thabay. But that's just a violent proc issue. Nephthys, 21% thing it needs a nerf. Then we have Nyx, for the most part is okay, but 29.9%. Nyx can be very frustrating to deal with sometimes. Miying, surprisingly, I thought more Miying owners, and this is why I included him in the last buff or nerf thing where we did not the poll, but the last time we did a units that need buffs before the balance patch, before the last balance patch. I included Miying. I thought people were going to still complain about him, thinking he needs a buff, but apparently people for the most part are okay with Miying. Vivachel for the most part is okay. Alexander for the most part is okay. Leona, ha ha ha, she does not need a buff. She does not need a buff. That unit can still solo teams. No joke. She shouldn't be able to solo teams, especially things that can do like strip and block beneficial effects and defense break and things like that. There's always the ignore defense option, but you don't know you're gonna fight Leona until the opponent drops her at the last minute. And they're like, hi, you didn't bring any counters to Leona, did you? I'm gonna drop Leona and I'm gonna solo your team with this unit. Now you have to ban it. Yeah, Pater, I actually think that Pater could use a little bit more blue here. I'm surprised he doesn't have more. He was much more useful in the Gani Hathor era than he is now. So I'm surprised there are more. I'm surprised there's this much blue for Leona, and well, maybe not. Maybe people just fight in cleave teams. Leona sucks against cleave teams. Leona's decent against control teams, though. Especially if she resists everything. That's kind of the thing, is if she resists all of the debuffs all the time, then you're boned. You can't do really anything. Yeah. Because that defense-based shield is ridiculous sometimes. Pater, again, I expected it to be more blue. Hertite is a solid unit. Bella is a solid unit. Finally, people are respecting the Bella. Mostly Obabo's doing, right? Irgar is not supposed to be an RTA unit. He is not supposed to be a PvP unit. He is supposed to be for the most part, the Rift Beasts. And he does a great job at that. He's not for everywhere. He is a unit that is supposed to be attainable for a Rift Beast god for all free-to-play players. So, or budget players that don't have better options. So keep that in mind. He is doing what he's intended to do. I don't think Comtros will change him. That's what he's supposed to do. Beelzebub is mostly fine. Ziana is mostly fine, but some people are not too happy with her. Mookwall is the same situation as Ziana. Van Cliff, about the same, but mostly fine. Gurkha, I could see him getting a little buff. He was toxic at one point in time, and then Comtros was like, wait, he might be too toxic. Didn't he do something crazy for SWC, last SWC? And then he got like, yeah, we can't let this happen again. Was it SWC or was it like one of the leading up to SWC and then he nerfed him right beforehand or something like that? I don't know. But for the most part, Daemon, Ungyuki are fine. Kiki is very toxic when Kiki wants to be very toxic. Yeah, that's quite a lot of cheddar cheese over there. Jackson can be sometimes very dangerous. I've had some nasty Jackson matches. Maya, decent amount of buff there, 35%. Maximilian can do some brutal stuff. Especially like Maximilian Tiana, Maximilian Robos, Maximilian Triton can do some nasty stuff, especially the speed lead. Like he's very similar to Asima, except Maximilian has a speed lead, which makes him very dangerous. he's a nasty unit. He's, in my opinion, one of the better LD5s, and I'm surprised more people don't really mention that he's one of the better LD5s in the game, or think the same way. But I guess they do. 22.5% over here. Ritsu 31.9. Destiny mostly fine. Elena Dark Pudding Princess mostly fine. Giselle Dark Macaron Guard needs a nerf. It's the violent procs. The violent procs where she's always got that defense breaks and the invincibility. If she didn't violent proc, it's another one. Like some of these units are, without violent runes, would not be half as toxic as they are. Oliver, Diana, Giselle's one of them. Maybe putting another cooldown on her skill 3. Would that nerf her too much? I feel like that could make her. You could actually find an opening there But if she violent procs, then there's really no opening. That's at least my thoughts on it. Dark Puppeteer, I'm glad that it needs a buff. This did get a buff. I think it's okay. For the most part, it's okay. Dark Gladiatrix, same thing. Most of these things are pretty red. Dark Devil Maiden, we really didn't get a chance to touch too much on some of these newer units. Gapsu, Dark Dokebi Lord, they are going to buff this unit, guaranteed. But what will the buff be, and when will it happen? Because if they buff it too much, this is a broken OP triple S tier unit. So they got to be very, this is the unit that they got to be very careful with what they do. So let's take a look now at the tier list. Kind of tier, it's not a tier list per se, but it is similar to a tier list. So we can see a visual representation. So like I said, not exactly a tier list, but we did use the tier list template to make this. So it does definitely look very much like a tier list. You could use it as a tier list. I'm not saying you can't. You could definitely use this as a tier list to find out what the most OP units in the game are. The Nat 5s, because obviously we're only talking about Nat. If that wasn't very obvious before, we're only talking about Nat 5s today. So yeah, the units that 50% of the people polled said need to be nerfed were nothing. So that's at least nothing is completely ridiculously broken. The Sky Surfers are pretty strong though. 40% plus nerfs on both of these. Next up we have the Riley and Tianlang, both very toxic units. Especially if you're trying to increase attack bar, then Tianlang is super nasty. But if you're not trying to increase attack bar, Tianlang is not really that dangerous. Riley, on the other hand, seems to always violent. You know what? This Oliver also seems to always violent proc. 20% or more players thought that these units should be nerfed. There's a lot of meta LD5s. We got the Occult Girls. We have Nephthys. We have the Dark Mage. We have Ragdoll. We have Julianne. Actually, some of these, I think we used to see Sheng Peng as one of these units over here, but not really so much anymore. I guess he's probably in the next tier. Actually, the next tier is basically fine. So most of these units are basically fine, but these are all the units people have the most frustrations with. So if you find your opponent picking a very meta team and you have any of these well, you probably don't have the LDs, but if you have any of these nasty units over here, if you have any of this one, could be some fun picks over here. These are mostly fine. There's really not too much to talk about if the unit is mostly considered fine. Again, some of these seem like more people would have called for a nerf on them, but no complaints. I mean, there are some of these things that I have that I think are very, very strong, but people aren't complaining they need a nerf, so, or not enough people anyway. So that's worth mentioning. And then we have the units that people voted need buffs. Some of these I disagree with, like for example, Zyra Sparta. I disagree. I don't think that they need buffs. Smicer, I definitely do not think she needs a buff. I think this needs a buff. I'm not going to complain about an Artemiel buff, but yeah. Elshana would be nice if he was reliable, like actually could guarantee some kind of steal any of those beneficial effects. That's usually the problem I have with this. Then we have 40% or more votes for needing a buff. Again, I think that this the Fire Mage is a solid enough unit. I don't think that needs a buff. I don't think that the Light Beast Monk needs a buff. I know I'm alone in that, but I also don't think that this Dark Vampire Lord needs a buff because he's not for PvP. He's for PvE. He's a PvE unit. What else? I think this is a solid unit too. Just my personal preference. And then we have some units. This is not for everywhere. Again, I'm surprised that this is where it is on this tier list. I mean, not tier list, on this buff or nerf visualization board. Buff or nerf visualization board. And then we have, what else? We have, these are the units that Comtos really needs to focus on. Because these are the units that enough people have voted on that they need to be changed. I disagree with Sigmaris, and I wish that they would have kept Beth's old form, but I think Comtos should focus on, again, this is not my opinion, but the lower this is on this list, the more Comtos needs to focus on it, and at least there's no 80% plus units. But this is pretty bad at 70%, so Comtos definitely should stick him in there in the next balance patch. And then it would be nice to see him buffed. And the rest of these, yeah. These are the units that you see used less and less and less and less, the lower down on the list you go. But anyway, that's it for this one. Hope you guys enjoyed it. This is a way too long video. I was not planning on making a video this long. I thought maybe 20 minutes, but there's a lot of videos where I think it's going to be 20 minutes, and then it turns out to be an hour-long video. So I apologize, and I hope you're having a lovely weekend, and we'll see what actually happens in the next balance patch. Anyway, I'll see you as always in the next one.